Hello, and welcome to Real Mindful. This is where we speak mindfully about things that matter. We meet here twice a month to introduce you to some of the teachers, thinkers, writers, researchers who are engaged in the mindfulness movement. You'll hear all kinds of conversations here about the science of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, and the heart of mindfulness. I'm Stephanie Domet. I'm the managing editor at Mindful Magazine and mindful.org, and this is Real Mindful. On this edition of Real Mindful, we'll pick up the thread of conversation between our founding editor, Boyce, and his longtime friend and colleague, Frank Ostaseski. Frank is a well-known and much-loved teacher of meditation, mindfulness, and compassionate service. He is an author and a healer and a great friend of Mindful Magazine. And in July 2019, a serious stroke affected his brain's capacity. In the months to come, he had 4 more strokes, and as many aspects of daily life became more difficult for him, Frank found strength and refuge in love, compassion, and curiosity. He also found his practice very much alive through the whole experience and his ability to communicate the nuance of what we discover when we welcome everything remains intact, and he shared some of that with Barry and with us. So, we pick up this remarkable conversation between old friends as Frank talks about the nature of our minds and how a useful comparison can be the ocean and its waves.
So in many schools, there's a simple metaphor that's given all the time of the ocean and the wave. And it's often used to describe a sense of oneness that we have with other things or a lack of separation. But another way to simply understand it is, on the surface, wind is creating wave. But wave isn't innately different than the ocean. It's still wet and salty, etc. But conditions are making it into a wave. There's no inherent wave. That's just the ocean taking that shape. Okay. But any scuba diver, which I was for a period of time when I loved it, will tell you that if you dive down deep, you'll find calmness. So what is also true is that's true of our minds. That at the surface of our minds, on the ordinary mind, we could call it, ordinary everyday mind, it's constantly being windswept by conditions, past history, trauma, etc. However, there is a dimension of mind which is always calm, and will not abandon us. We can rely on it. It will not abandon us. And it doesn't require being somebody special or being enlightened or any of these things. It simply is naturally there. It's just that we're so caught up, so preoccupied with what's at the surface that we don't recognize it, we don't see it. Training is required in order to see it. Just as you're going to go and become a scuba diver, it's good that you take a few lessons before you dive down, 40 or 50 meters. Yeah.
Well, I think C, quote unquote C, it's also perhaps, Frank, more than C. It's to have a more total experience of that, right? It's not just.
Yes. Yeah. But what I'm trying to get at is it isn't something special. It isn't the domain of enlightened beings or only
Right.
great teachers. It's available to everybody. Just like anybody can learn to scuba dive. We can learn to do this.
So we all have that. I appreciate that. That's it's innately there and available. To explore this imagery a little bit further, it seems at times we're drawn to the notion that we could live down there at the bottom of the ocean, and that we've set up this kind of dichotomy that the surface is this problem that we need to escape from. But we always need to navigate the surface, right? Even though we have that depth available. Am I not making sense, or?
No, you are making sense. I'm just trying to find a way to. So the way I would frame it is that maybe, I don't know when, but maybe as early in our life, we tend to bifurcate the personality, what we call the personality here. I'm not going to use any fancy psychological words, and this quality of what I would call deep mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we wind up splitting them apart and living in one. We live in the personality.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean the other's gone. It just means we forgot to access it. We don't live in that territory enough. We're preoccupied with what's at the surface. The wind is blowing on the surface of the water. So, no, they're not different, actually. They're not different. Everything comes out of that depth, everything, including all the stuff that's happening on the surface, all the drama. A friend of mine showed me a cartoon the other day. And the first panel is a person carrying a lot of bags on their back. And they said, childhood trauma, relationship issues, work stress, COVID, yeah? And then they come to a curb at the sidewalk, and on the curb it's written, life's minor inconveniences. And then the next panel is this person weeping into a puddle, having encountered one of life's minor inconveniences, because we're carrying all that stuff with us. And then we encounter something and we think, oh, the damn curb, but actually it's what we've been carrying along all along, right? So that's why I say understanding is necessary. It's not just transcendent. We have to understand something about our psychology, our emotional life, etc., so that we aren't only looking through those lenses.
Well, I think that's very clear. I'd like to come back to baggage a little bit later on.
Okay.
But I want to touch on something that you talked to me about not long after your first stroke, when we had probably lunch together.
Yeah, usually we eat. Yeah.
And it was about sequencing.
Yeah.
That, this kind of basic function of, okay, the socks are here and the shirt is there, and say a little bit about that, because that must have been very disorienting and practically quite challenging.
Well, honestly, I feel fortunate that the impact that the strokes had on me weren't more severe. I wasn't paralyzed. I had no physical paralysis, for example, just balance issues. So again, the part of my brain that was damaged, time, space, direction, and sequencing. So when we would say, let's go to the supermarket, and on the way we'll stop for a coffee, and maybe on the way back we'll get a bite to eat. Those are things that my brain could not track. It couldn't put those things in order. Putting things in order is part of how we make sense of things. It's part of how that perception that we were speaking of earlier functions.
Yeah.
This happens so quickly that we don't notice it. We see color, shape, and then there's seemingly almost automatic recognition of school bus.
Right.
It actually is a sequencing. It's a process of sequencing. If that capacity to sequence isn't there, then our ability to recognize and perceive the world as we perceived it before is altered, dramatically altered. Yeah.
How is it that you didn't just crumble in the face of that lack of such basic reference points?
Well, I did crumble often. Often I crumbled, and it was important to recognize that I'm nobody special here. I just kept learning from the experience.
So your ass would get kicked in a sense, and
absolutely. And I would just take to the bed, curl up in a fetal position, and weep.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's how it is. Right now, it's like this.
Right.
And so we have to recognize that that's not the only way it is, but it is that way now. So I don't think we can be free, Barry, if we are rejecting any part of ourselves, including the parts of ourselves that are not so functional sometimes, or not so, or damaged in some way, whether that's emotionally, psychologically, or physically damaged. So again, I think I had the support of really good people. My wife was she was incredibly supportive. And I was very fortunate to have that. And I have a community of people who were also adding or helping to care for me. And I had a practice which gave me stability.
As you're talking about the need to include all the parts of yourself, it reminds me of how we often talk about othering and compassion, you know, in the wider world, that, you know, if we can't include, if everybody isn't included, no one is included in a sense. So that also, you're saying, happens in the realm of all the different parts of one's own being.
Absolutely.
It begins there.
It happens on the micro and macro levels, if you will. Yes. Or said another way is, this is the reality that's here. And whenever I argue with reality, I lose.
Well, it's like similar to Gary Snyder's nature bats last. You know, reality bats last. You know,
yeah.
Right?
And I have to recognize, or I don't have to, it helps me to recognize that the things that are occurring are not adversaries, something I have to get rid of, but rather something that has some usefulness for me, can show me something valuable. Now, I can't see the value in it if I'm helter-skelter, but if I'm stable, I can understand something. So here's an example. I think I shared with you this before. After the first strokes, my doctors spoke a great deal about recovery. They talked to me a great deal about the benefits of neuroplasticity, which we speak about in mindfulness all the time. I realized in the beginning, or close to the beginning, that I was not as interested in recovery. I was interested in discovery. I was interested in seeing, what can this show me about myself and life? If I never get any of these qualities back, which is a strong possibility, what will I discover? And that became my road. That became the path that I followed, because I didn't know if anything would recover, but I knew I could keep discovering. So that was a kind of resilience that emerged for me that helped me enormously. It didn't require hope that I would one day recover everything I'd lost. It didn't require that. It required only trust and curiosity that I could continue to discover.
Well, that's a metaphor, if you will, because, you know, when we think of COVID and the incessant narrative that we're going to get back to normal.
I think back to normal is a lack of imagination.
So discovery rather than recovery is.
We may never recover. We may never go back to normal. We can't go back. You can't go back. And in my case, I might not have recovered any of my capacities. Some of them, for example, my vision, it's actually not my vision, my brain's capacity to process what the eye sees is not likely to come back. Neuroplasticity doesn't work very well in that particular function. So it's unlikely that I will be able to drive a car or do those things. That the brain doesn't, neuroplasticity doesn't work with that particular function, or it works only in about 7% of the cases. So if I hold out for recovery, I'm going to suffer.
Yeah, you actually, this isn't just a kind of trite birthday card slogan, discovery over recovery. You needed that.
Absolutely, I needed it. It's the way that I could continue to function in the world. It didn't require hope, as we normally think of hope, which is the flip side of fear.
Yeah.
It required clear intention and continuously letting go.
It's interesting as you talk about things that you may not recover in the conventional sense. So I've known you for decades, and I've seen a lot of different Franks. You know, that you're another Frank now,
Yeah.
clearly. There's a phase change and some continuity, which is, you know, pretty interesting. That I think that's how it is with us, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So again, bringing it back to the practice of mindfulness, I don't think our mindfulness practice is about somehow having some transcendent experience. That wasn't my experience with my strokes. What I do think it does is shift our identity. It shifts how we see ourselves and who we understand ourselves to be. Actually, I think that's actually what occurs through mindfulness practice. And that's really useful.
You don't get an experience, you don't get to a place, but you're transforming your relationship to who you are.
Yes, we're not only transforming our relationship to who we are the locus of our identity is shifting.
Right. The parts that we left out when we bifurcated.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
So you've talked about, I want to return a little bit to this, including parts of yourself. I've heard you talk about a practice you do in the morning, a morning practice and an evening practice. The evening practice.
Yeah.
Well, just describe that as the nighttime practice.
Well, earlier I said that sometimes I fall apart and I am in a fetal position crying. Well, that's not an uncommon experience for me. So at night, when I'm scared or I'm confused, I'm worried that I won't recover,
Yeah.
because that happens. I lie in bed and I think about all of the people who might be alone and frightened or in suffering. And this evokes in me a certain kind of compassion, a deep wish to relieve their suffering. Now, to be honest with you, Barry, I'm not very good at self-compassion. I've never been good at it. But really what happens when I evoke my compassion for others is that it spills over onto me, because I can't have it for others and not have it also include me. But when I start out with just me, it doesn't always work. People always say, well, you have to be compassionate toward yourself before you can be compassionate to others. And I don't agree.
Well, I mean, I think that, again, knowing you and having, made an intimate relationship with your book, I know that you had a long habit of beating up on yourself in a way that seemed to take you to these practices. Is
Yes.
that accurate to say?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say I have a very strong self-critic. I had a lot of trauma in my childhood, abuse and other things. I had a habit of not being always kind to myself. When I evoke my compassion for others, because of what we said earlier, that we can't pull ourselves apart from everybody else, it has to include me. It's like, even if I want to hold myself out on the margins, I can't. Yeah? Because it just doesn't fly. So that's my practice in the evening. I go to bed and I lie there and I try and evoke compassion for those people who are suffering. And it's not a Hallmark card. It's not wishy-washy, It's genuine. I can feel it because I feel my own suffering. I haven't yet felt my own compassion, but I feel my own suffering. Okay. So then in the morning, when I wake, I lie in bed before I've meditated or any of these things. And I, again, try and think of people in the world. And I ask myself the question, love, what would you have me do today? And it's a motivation for my day. And it's a way of orienting myself toward serving in the world, but also serving in the world with some degree of kindness and clear intention. And it comes back to also love becomes my support for the day. It's not just, oh, I'm a really good guy and I'm thinking about everybody else. When I evoke that love, it infuses me with a certain kind of support.
In the way it supported you, that infusing love supported you as you were walking on the on the gangway.
Exactly. So love has many different ways of expressing it. So love can be receptive or it can be expressive, for example. And it can express itself in many different ways. There's emptiness, right? There's boundlessness is maybe a better way to say it. And things emerge out of that boundlessness. Life emerges out of that boundlessness. Now, what's the force that causes that to happen? I mean, that's a very great philosophical thing, but what's the force that causes it to happen? In my experience, it's love.
Right, that's some kind of movement.
Right, that's what gives birth, if you will,
right,
to forms in the world, to people in the world, etc. And then what also dissolves it? It's also love. It dissolves it back into its original nature, if you will. So the force is love. And so when I evoke that force, it's incredibly supportive. It's not a Hallmark card. It's not a romantic idea. It is evoking the strength and the support of that particular quality which is innate to each of us.
Well, that stands in contrast to the conventional motivation to control the outcomes. Wake up in the morning that I'm going to be driven by controlling these outcomes.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't control my strokes happening.
Right.
Things are going to happen to us that we have no control over. And we do have, and we say we have control over our response to things. We don't even have control over that most of the time. But we got a better chance of responding skillfully if we've trained ourselves and if we've cultivated our contact with certain, we'll call them essential qualities in our nature. One of the most essential qualities in our nature is love. Now, it's too simplistic to think it's all love. That's New Age gobbledygook. We are more than just love. We have other qualities as well. But none of them, you can't take love out of the fabric.
At one point, when we were talking a while back in the early stages, my recollection is you said something to me about prior to the stroke, you would be able to rest in open space. And I may be misremembering this, but my recollection is you said, well, that particular methodology was not as easily available because open space also was disorienting. Is this bringing up any recollection of what you might have been talking about to me?
No, I actually think it's the opposite. That initially after the strokes, this, what I called non-conceptual awareness, it was just basically open space.
Yeah.
And the doorway to that open space, Barry, was vulnerability.
Right.
Vulnerability was the gate to it, because what we normally think of vulnerability is as weakness or the susceptibility to being harmed. But actually, when we sense into vulnerability, what it is open space, which has a certain permeability to it. And that's how I actually felt after the strokes. Now, what did not help me were what I learned. This is a better way to say it. I kept having altered states of mind, heart, and body. And so I used my mindfulness practice as I have been trained in an effort to stabilize and work with them. And sometimes it helped. But what I realized was that it didn't always help. And I had to develop new skills. And I did that by speaking to other people who had strokes.
Right.
And they helped me to understand. For example, if I was having emotional deregulation, let's call it,
Yeah.
Normally I would use mindfulness practice, stabilize, etc., allow the emotion, etc. When I do that after a stroke, it can just take over. So what I learned from other people with strokes is that sometimes I needed to do something different. For example, I needed to discharge the emotional activity, not stay with it. So it helped if I could shake my arms,
Right.
or shake my head, or concentrate on something, on one thing, my coffee cup. And then those things would help. Just calmly observing it all didn't actually help. When people close to me saw a kind of emotional reactivity, they said, "You've got to manage that better."
Yeah.
But what I recognized, I'm talking to other people with strokes, was that this was a physiological response. It's a bit like sweating or having a tic.
Yeah.
And I could no more stop my sweating by mindfulness practice than I could stop these experiences. However, I could sometimes discharge the energy and then return to my mindfulness practice. And that was a skillful thing to do. It's like when you're sitting on a mindfulness retreat, and you're getting too stressed out or you're getting too uptight. Then it's useful to go for a walk.
Yeah.
And after you go for a walk, then you can sit down again. But anyway, that's what so I learned about the relevance and the importance of discharging physical energy.
It's not necessarily always going to work to create a safe distance.
That's right. And mindfulness is not, I know in our world today, mindfulness is the new black. When I say the new black, I mean, like everybody in New York wears black in the fall or something.
Yeah.
It's not the fix-all for everything.
Yeah.
I know people who have tremendous concentration, but they have lousy interpersonal skills. And, they can sit for hours, but they have lousy interpersonal skills. Or and the opposite is true, right? People who have great interpersonal skills, psychologically, emotionally very aware, but they are continuously restless or agitated. So it's not the fix-all. And we have to bring in other practices that are complementary and support mindfulness practice.
Let's talk a little bit about time. The world, particularly, as the modern world continues to progress, our connection to clock time, to measured time, seems even greater as compared to like what some people call horticultural time, or where like C-sections have gone up because the medical world wants to put birth on the clock. Mm-hmm. There's many dimensions to time, which enables us to say, then, wow, that dragged on. When in another situation, the same amount of clock time flew by. So what's been your relationship with time, and how time is carved up by the regular world? And just say a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, again, my strokes, particularly the first stroke, played with my sense of time. And my life became, in a sense, a certain kind of flow, which sounds really wonderful and yummy, but actually was challenging at times. It wasn't easy for me to track what I call TikTok time, and this had both pragmatic and also emotional challenges. I mean, one example is when I got out of the hospital after my strokes, my wife asked me, where did I want to go? And I said, I want to go under the redwood trees. I wanted to lean against the big redwood tree.
Right.
And so we went to a neighboring town where there's a library located in the redwood trees. And while we were sitting there, she said, I'll be back in a few minutes. I got to go get something from the car. Now, remember, I said earlier, I couldn't track what a few minutes were.
Right.
And here's the practical side. While I was sitting there, not knowing when she would come back, I had to pee. Now, what do? I can go pee in the bushes, but I might frighten off the young children.
Right.
Or I could pee in my pants, which wasn't a very attractive option. So I decided I would find my way into the library, and that's a direction issue. That's a sequencing issue. So I came up these kind of rugged staircases and found my way into the library, and even found my way to the men's room. And when I had finished, I was coming out of the library and I heard my wife screaming, "Where are you, Frank? Where are you?"
Right.
She was terrified. She didn't know where I was. And I could, my heart broke for her. And I came out of the library and I found the sound. I followed the sound of her voice. And I came to her and said, I'm okay. And I held her. I just held her because she was terrified. She didn't know what had happened to me. So there was a very pragmatic issue, but also emotional consequences from my not being able to track time.
Right.
Yeah. And so when like we're having in the pandemic, people are having lots of emotional responses to the fact that a great deal of time has gone by and they've lost track of
Right.
their normal sense of what a month is and what a year is, for example. Yeah. And sometimes we have to comfort each other in that, as I needed to comfort my wife.
So while from the realm of the deep ocean and non-conceptual space, TikTok time is not so significant, it's a very important, skillful means.
I think it is significant. I think it's quite important that it's not a mistake that we have an ego structure. It's not a mistake that we develop a sense of individuality. This is not an error. This is how we develop. And, it wasn't something imposed upon us. Yeah? This is how we develop. Again, coming back to our image of the ocean, each wave is incredibly beautiful and unique. Beautiful, just as you and I sitting here, beautiful when I look at you. But we're not separate. And so we can be unique, we can be individual without being separate. And it doesn't take a big philosophical stance. We just have to look around and we see it to be true.
So that's beautiful. And in terms of the time, the arena of time, the TikTok time and the big time can be reconciled.
They're not different. They're just two expressions of the same thing. Just like the wave is an expression of the ocean and its depth is an expression of the ocean. Not different.
See, I bring it up because so many folks that we work with are trapped by their TikTok time, and that if I only had more, but the possibility of learning how they are not different, the big time and the small time.
They are of the same origin, so to speak, we could say. They're not apart. We bifurcate them. My wife was very popular, commonly said to me whenever I complained about time, she said, Obama has the same 24 hours that you have. He just seems to get a lot more done in it, It's not, the time is not the problem.
Well, and I think in terms of what you were saying about ego structure and structures generally, the many, many structures that, make life, they're not a mistake. The only error or the error is in solidifying them as one solid thing or something we have to fight. It seems to me, there is the problem of identity isn't that there's identity, it's when it sees itself as only that, as separate.
Right. That's well said, or that's very well said. Thank you. I mean, so our ordinary mind, let's call it, is patterned. It's patterned by various conditions that others have created for us and we've lived through, etc. The problem is not that it's patterned. The problem is how we use our ordinary mind. The fact that we get stuck in the patterns and forget that there's any other options, that's the problem.
Right. Lack of imagination, you said earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, when you think about our ordinary mind, it's pretty amazing. I mean, wow. When I watch my granddaughter, who's now almost 6, how I've seen her brain and mind develop is phenomenal. Learning a language, conceptualizing time and space, it's phenomenal, Ordinary mind is really necessary. I mean, think of apple, right?
Right.
We all have apple, right? We have a understanding of what apple is. We conceptually understand it. We have an image of it. We have context for it. We can think of its many varieties, how it gets used in apple pie, etc. That's pretty phenomenal. But if we cut open the brain, we couldn't find apple anywhere.
Well, I find it's almost what you'd call an ordinary kind of magic, that air comes out of our lungs, is cut into pieces by the mouth, an apple comes out, and you see an apple. We can see that, and your granddaughter is doing that for the first time, maybe, and it's quite it's beautiful. Right, we don't
exactly.
Yeah,
let's not disregard the ordinary mind. Let's not throw it out. Let's see that we need it. And I would go on to say that we need the ordinary mind to understand. We need the clarity of the ordinary mind to understand what I'm calling the deep mind.
Right.
It's not separate. Even if you have some state of illumination, Barry, you need clarity to know that state of illumination. And that clarity is developed by the ordinary mind. So the problem isn't the ordinary mind. The problem is the way we use it. If we only stay with what's familiar and known, we're stuck.
Would you say that the stroke had to push you farther along on your path, in a sense? Choicelessly?
Yes, I would say that. I would say that my sense of curiosity grew. It was pretty strong before, but it grew as a result of the stroke because I now had to find new pathways through the woods. I couldn't rely on my previous knowing alone. I had to discover, again that word, I had to discover a new way, oftentimes a new way of thinking, functioning, emoting in the world.
It reminds me of when, in your early days of coming to meditation, you finally came around to talking to your teacher at that time, Stephen. He pushed you in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And it occasioned a lot of growth. And to me, it feels like, not to make it too fancy, but the stroke has been a teacher like Stephen.
Yes, and I don't recommend it as a path.
No shit. I know somebody who lost a lot of weight on opiates and had to get off of them. Said, hey, I don't recommend this as a weight loss program.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my dear friend Ram Dass often spoke about his stroke as fierce grace from his teacher. At the very beginning, he didn't experience it as fierce grace. It took him a little while to come to that understanding. Yeah.
Yes, and both you and he have been fortunate in being able to have more function than a lot of people end up with, and also you've probably been helped along by your approach to resilience, but nevertheless.
Yeah. Our practice, our relationships, like you and I, a long friendship we've had, they're important in our understanding. Practice sometimes suddenly and most of the time gradually, there's an identity shift through it, right? We stop seeing ourselves solely as the child of our parents. We stop seeing ourselves only as the accumulation of our drawbacks and our difficulties in life, right? Which have been at the center of our lives. And we start to see ourselves as something more than that. Like my friend Norman Fisher, wonderful, great teacher. When his mother was dying, nice Jewish lady, she said, "What do the Buddhists think about what happens to you after you die?" And Norman, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said something like, well, it depends on who you think you are. If you think that you're just this body, mind, and heart, and just these memories and experiences that you've acquired, and just the relationships that you've had over your life, well, then death is very bad news because you're going to lose all that. But if you think you're also more than this, something that maybe you don't even understand, but you have some confidence in, then it's going to make your dying a lot easier. And even you can be happy when you die. Yeah. Because you know yourself to be more than the small separate self you've taken yourself to be.
That's lovely. That was a very poignant time in my life when my mom asked me the very same question. We were driving out in the country, and she had avoided ever talking about anything even approaching the topic of death. And then she came out with it. And I feel like it occurred because of something I learned from you about listening in this very big way, welcoming. That's one of the reasons we were driving in the country. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you about listening, because I have observed that you've cultivated somehow a quality of listening that is, to give an example, I've heard you speak to somebody when your manifestation is you're just a phone on a table, and somehow it's conveyed to the person that you're hearing and feeling it all. And that seems so important in the work of helping people in their worst moments.
Well, I think I'm more than a phone on the table, but I understand what you're saying.
No,
I try not to make myself someone special, but I think that there's a generosity in it. There's a generosity, and I don't mean that I'm magnanimous. I just mean we listen generously. We listen without interfering. So I live on the boat. So there's a wonderful expression that you probably know, coming alongside.
Right?
And you don't head straight into the other boat, that you're going to come along, you come alongside them, because there's a gentle process there where you don't impose yourself on the other person. And so often when we're listening, we're busy trying to figure out what we should say next. And actually, listening is coming alongside. Yeah, that's all that's required. And it's a kind of, I don't know how else to say it. It's that gentle and that easy. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have a set of shoulds and judgments. Yeah.
Well,
one of
that's a
the
super simple guideline that speaks volumes. And when I'm saying you were just manifesting as a phone on someone's table, somehow they knew that you were coming alongside, and I just think that's because you're not filtering. You're not trying to, okay, Jane, here's what I'm looking for from you.
Right. So the image that I use, and I've used it with you before, is I have a lot of tools that I've acquired over the years, a big toolbox full of them. But I don't set that toolbox down between me and someone who needs to be listened to. I don't lead with my tools, I lead with my humanity. And when I need a tool, fine, I can pick it out of my back pocket and use it. One of the great teachers in my life was Carl Rogers, the great psychologist, right? And for years, I carried around this tattered piece of paper in my back pocket with a quote from him that I've always loved. And I'm going to paraphrase, but basically he says, before every session that I have with a client, I take a moment to remember my humanity. And he says, then there's no experience that this man, this woman has had that I cannot share with them. No fear I can't understand, no pain I cannot be with, because I too am human. And no matter how deep his or her wound, they don't need to be ashamed of it in front of me, because I too am vulnerable. That's what he says. And because of that, that's what allowed the healing to begin. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like that.
It seems, Frank, that by doing that repeatedly, it became instinctual or becomes instinctual.
Yes, I think I agree. And of course, a really important facet of that is meditation as deep listening. Mindfulness as deep listening. That is an internal process, of course, but also is externally expressed in the exchange with the other person. So that's primarily what mindfulness practice is: deep listening to ourself and the world, until we have such an intimacy with ourself and the world that we don't feel the sense of separation anymore.
So not listening just with the ears, in a sense.
No, listening with your whole being. When you do enough mindfulness practice, what happens? I mean, the object of the mind or body and heart arises, and you know it immediately. It's not like you've assessed it and said, oh, there's this and that. You just know it immediately. It's one thing. The object, whether it's a thought, a feeling, or a physical experience, and the knowing of it. It becomes one thing. So the intimacy here isn't so much about I get close to it. It is I am intimate with it. I know myself to be not apart from it.
Last question.
Okay.
So your adult life has been characterized by service. And you've aged. You've had a lot of alterations in your circumstances. You've had some plans dashed here and there. Have the ways you're able to serve, have they shifted? And do you feel limited in any way, or more available? Or how is this service manifesting now for you?
Well, of course, now we're in the time of COVID. So I'm not getting on airplanes and flying to be with groups of people to teach retreats or seminars. I'm doing it on Zoom. And I have to, like everybody else, adapt to that medium. And what I have found is that what's most important is the quality of presence. And that is when you're resting in presence, and I don't just mean being available, like being present, I mean really resting in presence as a palpable quality of awareness. The medium doesn't matter so much. The medium you're using doesn't matter so much. So I try as best I can to cultivate my contact with presence. If I have a single practice, Barry, it is that when I wander away from presence, I realize it and I try and come back. Yeah. And then the presence, I'm using this fancy word, guides me in what to say or do next. It isn't my shtick,
Right.
It's how I'm being informed by the quality of loving awareness, let's call it, as Ram Dass would call it, and the nature of the relationship that you and I, for example, are having now.
So you certainly had some of that quality when you were physically present way back when you were learning to work with patients in the hospice.
Yes.
All these years later in TikTok time. How is it different?
Well,
in addition to the COVID
I'm more familiar with my vulnerability now. So it gives me more, there are fewer defenses now. There are fewer barriers between myself and the other. So I'm more available in a way to them and to myself. Having been on the other side of the sheets, so to speak, in the hospital, being the patient in the hospital gives me a great deal more empathy, not only for the patients, but for the clinicians and caregivers who are being driven mercilessly by the systems in which they work. When I was in the hospital as a patient, I wasn't so much worried about myself, honestly. But I was really worried about the clinicians who were taking care of me. They were a mess.
Right. And that empathy is a gateway to compassion, as you were.
It can be. It can be. It can also be a gateway to overwhelm.
Right.
And so we need to be careful about that, not to be empathetically overloaded. That's where mindfulness practice becomes important, because it becomes a balancing factor for empathy.
Right.
And I'm speaking to the choir here, but there's a big difference when someone's suffering and I want to do something to them to relieve their suffering so my personal distress will be relieved.
Yes.
That's different than, that's me focused. Compassion is other focused. I do something to relieve their suffering because it's the guidance of my deepest wise heart. Yeah.
Well, and as you were saying earlier, to conclude that, suggesting that functioning ordinary mind can help us to see those kinds of distinctions. It's very helpful in that way.
That's right. It's important that we have, ideally, some cognitive clarity.
Frank Ostaseski in conversation with Barry Boyce. You can read a condensed version of their conversation in the February edition of Mindful Magazine, which you'll find on newsstands now, or you can read that conversation at mindful.org. In the meantime, if you enjoyed listening to this episode of Real Mindful, would you consider leaving us a review? You can do that wherever you find podcasts, and your review can help other listeners decide whether to take a chance on Real Mindful. You can write to us as well. Drop us a line at yourwords@mindful.org. And perhaps you know, perhaps you don't, we have a weekly practice podcast called 12-Minute Meditation. And that's based on the idea that scientific research is revealing that 12 minutes of meditation practice a day can yield some of the benefits we all look for: increased focus, clarity, calm, compassion, creativity. So every week we offer a fresh mindfulness practice right into your ears from a leading mindfulness expert, and you can subscribe to 12-Minute Meditation wherever fine podcasts are found, including on mindful.org. We'll be back soon with another episode of Real Mindful for you. Until then, remember to cultivate your contact with presence.